Okay. Hello, good morning, and thank you for hosting me here. It's very wonderful to be here. So I'm Dr. Thomas Giddens from St Mary's University, Twickenham in London. And I'm just going to talk to you today about the intersections of crime and comics. Okay, so it's focusing particularly on crime, representations of crime, and the way in which, in particular, the regulation of the comics form, particularly in the US across the 20th century, has shaped the development of the medium, both in terms of its content and in terms of its ability to engage with questions of crime and criminal justice. Okay, so kind of two broad sections to what I'm going to talk about this morning. So the first half, roughly, is more historical. So it's focusing on the relationship between comics and juvenile delinquency. Okay, so the early comics form was thought to be a direct cause of juvenile delinquency, which led to the Comics Code in the US and various kind of similar kind of free speech infringements in other jurisdictions. So after kind of tracing that kind of development, I'm then going to move on in the second half of the paper to focus on more recent, more contemporary comics after the code began to abate in the 1980s. And just picking out a few kind of key criminal justice type themes. So vigilantism and retribution, obviously being the kind of leading kind of example in the mainstream comics, and then crime and politics as a kind of a counterpoint to that kind of mainstream that thinks about law and criminal justice in more kind of critical ways. So that's roughly what I'm going to be doing, focusing on very much the mainstream kind of Western traditions of comics, so the kind of mostly published in the US and some in the UK, so the kind of English language comics, which is because the idea of this paper is to kind of be a bit of a retrospective, a bit of a reflection on the current engagement with crime and comics in kind of criminological and criminal justice research. So most of that is that I'm engaged with anyways is Anglo-American, so it focuses on Anglo-American subject matter. So that's kind of where we're going. So, back in the 1930s, the FBI sanctioned a crime comic, okay, called War on Crime. So this was J. Edgar Hoover, recognized that comics were very popular and very powerful in their ability to communicate ideas. So he sanctioned a kind of a true crime comic, telling true stories of the FBI winning the war on crime. This was really popular, and it kind of spawned a whole kind of industry of crime comics that developed through the 30s and into the 50s. So a lot of it was kind of true crime, but also kind of fictional crime obviously developed as well. So back in these days, comics were a lot more than just superheroes. Okay, so there's lots of other genres kind of at play, including horror comics, romance, war, adventure, and that kind of thing. So it wasn't just about superheroes. So J. Edgar Hoover sanctioned this comic book, and it developed this kind of industry of crime comics. So there were lots and lots of crime comics, and there were lots of also horror and other kind of comics as well. And the problem with this was that it led to widespread popular kind of backlash, kind of a moral panic about the ability of comics to cause juvenile delinquency and to cause criminality. So one of the kind of leading people that kind of fought this war against comics was this guy in the top right. He is a psychiatrist called Frederick Wortham. And he was very, very vocal against comics. He wrote this book, The Seduction of the Innocent, which flat out claimed that comics were a direct cause of juvenile delinquency. Yeah, so even from this very kind of early kind of period of the modern comics form, the connection between comics and crime is very overt. Okay, and Wortham was very much fighting this battle in relation to comics' relationship with crime. So he claimed that comics caused juvenile delinquency and went on this kind of moral crusade to kind of get comics banned, to get comics regulated, to save the future generations from becoming criminal. So there was quite a lot of debate in the academic literature at the time, and so although Wortham was adamant that there was a direct link between comics and crime, the academic studies and the academic literature at the time was a bit more equivocal. There was no clear link necessarily seen. But despite this, comics were very much framed as being for children, which is part of the problem. Okay? So because comics were seen as being juvenile, as being for children, much of the debate around the form and about its right to free speech was quite difficult. So although the form was protected under the First Amendment in terms of free speech, it was kind of hard to justify their freedom of speech when there was child welfare at stake. So this is quite a famous quotation from the case of Winters and New York, where the judiciary in the US held that comics did have free speech, but in a rather backhanded manner. As you can see, it says, though we can see nothing of any possible value to society in these magazines, they are as much entitled to the protection of free speech as the best of literature. Yeah, so they had free speech protections, but they did not have political legitimacy in terms of the relationship between comics and juvenile delinquency. Okay, so because of this, and because of Wortham's activism against comics, the question of crime comics and the suitability of comics for children was included in the 1953 Senate Judiciary Committee's subcommittee on juvenile delinquency. Okay, so this is kind of very much in the US context. And there was a kind of a debate at that hearing about the legitimacy and the suitability of some of the material being published in these various crime and horror comics, some of which were very gruesome, others which engaged in social critique and were kind of legitimate value as social critique. Because there was this free speech protection under the Constitution and under Winters in New York, the subcommittee refused to enforce regulation. Okay, so they wouldn't kind of put censorship in place because they had a right to free speech. But there was this political movement, and because of the weight of the political kind of anger at stake and the moral panic, the comics industry put in place a form of self-regulation called the Comics Code. Okay, so there was no official forced regulation, but because of the political climate, they had to accept some self-regulation and put that in place. So this was a voluntary code run by the Comics Code Authority, and they set up various guidelines in terms of what a comic could do, what content there could be in a comic, and the way it could engage with state authority and representatives of the police force and representatives of the justice system and so on. It was voluntary, so nobody thought it would really work, but because of the political climate at the time, if you didn't have Comics Code Authority approval for your publications, then nobody would stock your comics, nobody would distribute your publications. Okay? So although it was voluntary, it very much did work. And then there was, suddenly you could only really sell comics that had Comics Code Authority approval. And the Comics Code Authority approval was very much a blanket code. Okay? So there was no kind of regulation in terms of different age groups. It was anything under the code was suitable for readers of all ages. Yeah, so again, it reinforced this idea that comics were for children. Yeah, so all comics had to be suitable for children to read. So you can see this is very much an engagement between comics and crime, in terms of the causes of crime, but also in the way that comics were engaging with the representation of criminality in the pre-code era. And you've got this interplay of culture, of power, of legitimacy, and of criminality and crime, all jumbling up together to produce this comics code. The thing about the code was it had some quite significant ramifications for the development of the medium. So as I said, it solidified the idea that comics were for children by enforcing this kind of blanket code which said everything had to be suitable for a certain age of reader. And it also removed the potential for comics to engage in critique and questioning of crime, justice, state authority, and so on. So under the code, you could not present any form of moral ambiguity. You could only present good and evil. Good always had to win. Yeah, so the bad guys always had to be punished. So there was no moral ambiguity. And there was no capacity to be able to question state authority. Yeah, so some of the issues before the code, there were stories of like corrupt cops, alcoholic cops, and that kind of thing. Under the code, you couldn't even engage with those kinds of questions. So you can see how this kind of radically shaped the capacity of the medium to develop as a kind of a critical art form. And off the back of the code, it was very much the superhero genre that was able to survive. Okay, the horror comics obviously were very difficult to do now. Crime comics were kind of politically out of favor. A lot of these regulations obviously got in the way of what superhero narratives tended to do. But because the superhero genre itself wasn't involved in the moral kind of crusades of Wortham, it was able to adapt. Yeah, and DC in particular, and then followed by Marvel, created lots of new superheroes that were well suited to kind of operating under the code. So you end up with a lot of these superheroes that were very, very good, or good always triumphing over evil, and the bad guys. Well, interestingly, the bad guys, because you could present no moral ambiguity, and because you could not engage with any presentation of why somebody might commit crime, okay, you couldn't present criminals as in any way sympathetic or as in any way acting rationally. So what that meant was bad guys, criminals, could only ever act because they were evil. Okay, you could give no good reason why somebody would engage in crime. Okay, so criminals acted because they were evil, and then they were punished for that. So the Joker is a really good example of a supervillain that was almost a kind of a direct product of the restrictions of the code. Okay, so the Joker, there's no real reason for what he does. He is just mad, and he is evil, and he is kind of a chaotic psychopathy. Yeah, which is the kind of epitome of the criminal under the comics code. Yeah, because the code wouldn't allow you to engage in questions of why somebody might commit crime, the structural kind of causes of criminality and social inequality and all those kinds of things. Okay. So this is just a kind of a bit of commentary on the code. So it was intentionally designed to control how creators portrayed agents of hegemonic order of the state. The comics code serves as an example of how hegemonic pressure can shape popular media's construction of criminal justice ideology. Yeah, so it's not just a restriction on free speech in terms of making it suitable for kids, but it changes the ability of the medium to engage in critical questioning of social value around crime and justice. Okay, so that's the kind of roughly the first part. Talking about the history of the code and the way it infringed the criminal justice capacities of the comics medium. The code is now not in force. It began to abate from around the 1980s and was eventually abolished in 2011, I think. One of the key moments in the kind of the maturation of the form and of the abatement of the code itself are these three publications here. So this is issues number 96, 97 and 98 of The Amazing Spider-Man. Okay, so this is kind of a watershed moment in the mainstream comics publication history. So Richard Nixon didn't like drugs. You may remember the war on drugs. And neither did Stan Lee, the guy who ran Marvel. So with President Nixon's request, Stan Lee wanted to use Spider-Man to tell a story about the dangers of drug use. Okay, to kind of talk to the youth of America about why drugs are bad. And he wanted to do this through Spider-Man. So he had a presidential mandate. Yeah, Richard Nixon had told him to do this. But because of the restrictions of the code, he couldn't tell a story about the dangers of drug use under the comics code. Okay, so he wrote this story, submitted it to the comics code for approval, and was rejected. Okay, because it was dealing with difficult questions around morality and drug use. But they published it anyway. Okay, as we saw before, the code was optional. So they published it anyway, and people still bought it, and people still stocked it, yeah, because it was Spider-Man, because it was Marvel, because the moral panic had abated from earlier in the century. And you'll notice, when things are published under the code, there is this logo in the top right corner, appears in the top right corner of the publication cover. Okay? And you notice on these there is no Comics Code Authority stamp. So this series of comics were led to, it was widely accepted at the time, it was critically acclaimed and so on, and it led directly to a reform of the Comics Code to allow for important social critique, yeah, and the questioning of so critical engagement with law and order and morality and so on. So very much a watershed moment. Off the back of that, through the 80s, a number of non-code comics began to be produced. And there are three particular publications that, because of their kind of critical depth and rigor, are seen to be kind of key for the maturation of the medium. Yeah, key for that slippage of the code. And these are they. So we have Frank Miller's The Dark Knight Returns, with an aging old Batman struggling to regain control over Gotham. We have Watchmen, which we'll talk a little bit about later on, from Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons, which kind of deconstructs the whole superhero genre. And then we have Art Spiegelman's Pulitzer Prize winning Mouse, retelling the story of his father's times during the Holocaust. And these three comics were not done with code approval, but they were widely critically acclaimed, and they're seen as kind of key in the shift away from the code and the recognition that comics are not just for children and have critical worth as well. Okay, so this brings us to the more contemporary kind of part of the paper. I'll just talk about some of the kind of key themes in relation to criminal justice in comics publications. Okay, so if you think about the mainstream, think about superheroes, the kind of dominant theme, perhaps, is vigilantism and retribution. Okay, so there's quite a lot of criminal justice research, criminological research, looking at superhero publications and mainstream publications, particularly in the US. And they find overwhelmingly that the majority of stories, the majority of titles, are presenting a retributive ideal of justice. Yeah, that bad guys need to be punished. Okay, and they deserve to be punished. And in some ways you can see that as a product of the Comics Code. Yeah, the kind of history of the medium has been shaped by this presentation that has to punish bad guys. Some evidence suggests that there is a stronger tendency towards retribution in times of social anxiety. So during the Cold War, for example, it's suggested that there is a stronger move towards retribution in superhero comics. But other evidence suggests that it's always there, all the time, more generally. Nikki Phillips and Stacey Strobel's work, in particular, as wide-ranging analysis of around 200 titles, found that there was a tendency towards retribution that sought the re-establishment of a nostalgic order of peace in the community through retribution. Yeah, so good punishing evil. Just a few examples. So the Punisher is obviously the leading example in terms of retribution and vigilantism. So the Punisher is a really hard, right-wing, violent, retributive character. He rejects all forms of state and abstract legal authority and works from his own anger at wrongdoing. And his punishment is therefore pure because it comes from his own pure moral anger rather than some sort of legal abstraction. Sorry for all the lawyers. We then have the Vigilante, who is less well known than the Punisher, but the Vigilante is kind of the other end of the scale. So the Punisher kind of loves what he does and thinks he's wholly morally justified. The Vigilante went mad trying to justify his use of violence as a mode of punishment outside of state authority. So he was trying to cope with the justifications of what he was doing and ended up losing his mind. So they're kind of two extremes. In the middle we have Green Arrow, who's kind of representative of more of the kind of mainstream superheroes, so working outside of state authority, some discourse on the legitimacy of their kind of use of force and so on, but ultimately representative of standing up for what is good, where maybe the state is failing to do so. There's some suggestion that the whole superhero genre itself is based on the ideals of fascism and right-wing lynch mobs, with the dressing up in costumes and make links to the Ku Klux Klan, for example, and the idea of going out and seeking justice yourself rather than doing things through the system. There's debates around the extent to which that folds through to the entirety of the medium. So, on one sense, comics are this kind of vigilante retribution kind of idea, particularly in the mainstream superhero stuff. But you can see it also as a kind of a cultural expression of anxieties around what do we do about crime and justice. Okay, so again, Phillips and Strobel's work engages with the way that fan discussions, for example, around key moments in leading titles reflect kind of cultural discussion around the kind of morality of killing, the morality of using violence to protect, and so on. So in some sense, the engagement with vigilantism and retribution in comics, in superheroes, is a kind of a cultural source, a cultural resource for engaging in these kinds of difficult questions of crime and justice on a kind of a popular kind of cultural level. Because they're vigilantes, because they're seeking justice outside the state, this also opens up discourse to questions around the legitimacy of the state and the legitimacy of state authority, and the legitimate use of violence. So that's another kind of avenue of kind of research that's going on. This raises a paradox. Okay, so if vigilante superheroes are seeking a better world, they're seeking true justice, where the state is failing to do so because it's corrupt or overly capitalist or whatever, then that can sometimes raise a problem. So if you think of Batman, for example, he's seeking justice outside the state because the state is corrupt, but the justice he's pursuing is the justice of Bruce Wayne, who's just another rich white guy. Yeah? So there's a kind of a paradox where the forces outside the hegemony of the state kind of reflect the same kind of ideologies of the mainstream state in real life. Okay, but regardless, there is something about superheroes that can be read as this symbol of justice beyond the state order. Yes, we can make connections with natural law, with resistance to state power, but this paradox maybe lingers. Okay, so as I said, there's a lot of suggesting that comics are to do with retribution, but that's not necessarily true of all superhero comics and all mainstream comics. So the idea that they're purely retributive is a bit too monolithic, and there is quite a lot of engagement with difficult questions around politics and the legitimacy of state violence. So just to go through a few examples. So Watchmen, as I already mentioned, goes through this deconstruction of the very idea of heroism and the very idea of the superhero itself, and works to implicate the audience in the desire for kind of retributive justice. Yeah, so we have Rorschach is one of the main characters, and he's a bit like the Punisher. He's very hardcore right-wing retributive violence. But because he has a Rorschach blot for his face, the audience is kind of implicated in his desires for violence. So it raises difficult questions there. Judge Dredd, to flip to the kind of UK European context, Judge Dredd was explicitly created as satire against Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan's right-wing criminal justice policies. So Judge Dredd, for those of you who don't know, is a very right-wing seeker of justice on the streets. He has a gun, which is called a lawgiver, which shows you the deep connection between violence and justice in the world of Judge Dredd. And the judges are kind of glorified cops. Yeah, so they go around on the streets, they see crimes, they sentence and judge there on the streets, to the extent that sometimes they execute people on the streets. And that was seen as written explicitly as satire against Margaret Thatcher. But the irony was is that in the early days, a lot of the audience really, really liked Judge Dredd and thought he was great. So they had to make the satire more obvious as it went on. We then have the kind of links between superheroes and sovereignty more generally. So Neil Curtis has just written a book on this, making lots of progressive connections between the way superheroes engage with questions of sovereignty and legitimate use of violence and legitimate use of power, and the delineations between friends and enemies and so on. So there's a bit more complexity going on than just retribution. And post 9/11 in particular, a lot of mainstream superheroes have started to engage in questions around security and liberty and the state of exception. So there's a series called Batman Incorporated, where Batman sets up an international organization to fight terrorism, and gets into all these difficult questions around exception, security, liberty, torture, and so on. So although retribution and vigilantism is kind of a big theme, when you look perhaps at particular examples, you can see a more detailed, more critical engagement with those kinds of questions than a kind of a wide-angled kind of summary might see. So just to kind of conclude then, we've seen that crime as a concept has shaped the development of the comics medium. Okay, so in the early days, its fears of its connection with the causes of crime was then used to use a kind of a criminal sanction, in a sense, to infringe the free speech of the medium, and thus also infringe its ability to engage in questions of crime and justice. So crime is very much interlinked with the history of comics. Just to kind of think a bit more broadly, comics can also potentially represent an alternative form of kind of crime and justice knowledge, in a sense. So as a kind of a critical medium for engaging in these kinds of questions, we can use comics as an alternative discourse alongside more traditional text-based or statistical discourse to think about the meanings of crime, justice, and questions of the legitimacy of state authority, and so on. Okay, thank you.
Does anybody have any questions, perhaps, for a speaker? No? Somebody? No? Yeah, Dorian. Okay.
Okay, so I have a question that is maybe not directly and strictly connected to the comics. It's about part 1, and I noticed that you talked about how comics were seen as purely child-directed form, and they were also viewed as like a direct cause for violence or juvenile delinquency. And I have a question: do you think this is kind of a similar thing going on right now with video games, where they are seen as the cause of violence and also directed for children?
Thank you.
Yes. I'll say more than that. Yeah, so you can see it in the history of cinema as well. So when new art forms come in, there tends to be a bit of a popular backlash against them. But with comics in particular, and also with video games, there is I don't quite know why, because it's to do with play, because it's simplistic, because it's text and image, I don't know. But there seems to be this assumption that it's for kids. Yeah, because you use the pictures alongside the words, it looks like a picture book, looks like a children's book. And I think with video games as well, because it's a game, it's for children. And there was a similar kind of moral kind of panic around video games before they brought in the rating system. Even after they brought in the rating system, in the UK at least, there was still lots of problems because people didn't know that the rating system existed, or didn't know that it was the same as the ones you get on films and things. So yeah, but I think it's not exclusive to comics. I think that kind of fear of a new media can be seen in cinema and also in games as well. Yeah.
That's a question. No, so I'll have one question. Is it possible? Sorry.
Right next to you.
Sorry.
Okay, thank you. Just before I ask my question, I wanted to ask you, have you read Marvel's Civil War 2, the recent series? Okay, so my question is that, it happened in many other titles, but in this one most recently, that the comics, the storyline started engaging in the questions of what type of justice should we pursue. In Civil War II, we have two sides: Captain Marvel on one side, who found out some information that in the future someone will commit a crime, and she wants to stop that person before they commit a crime. And opposite her is Iron Man, who believes that we should punish the crime and not the prospect of a crime. And do you believe that there is a place for such discussions in comics? Because such a question doesn't really allow us to, allow the creators to provide us with an answer, because there is no one answer, conclusive answer that they can give, and that's not something that, in my opinion, people tend to prefer in comics. Storylines should be concluded with some sort of answer given, and here we can't really give one. So do you believe that such discussions have a place in comics? Thank you.
Okay. Yes. Again. So I think that kind of engagement with difficult kind of moral, juridical questions is important and valuable. Not only for people like me that want to study comics for a living and have to extract complexities, but also I think because those kinds of questions are genuinely of interest, I think, to a lot of people. Those kinds of moral ambiguities and debates over what the approach to justice should be and what's at stake in criminal justice. And in some ways, although there is an argument that maybe a narrative should have a nice, neat ending, but I don't agree with that. I like stories to be complex and ambiguous in many ways. And I think, particularly for kind of critical engagement with a question, the kinds of stories that don't give an answer, that leave it open, enable more discussion and more engagement with that kind of critical question than others. So some of Nikki Phillips and Stacey Strobel's work that I mentioned, they were using, there's a particular episode in Justice League where Green Arrow kills somebody, and they were using the kind of fan debates around the legitimacy of his killing, alongside social media reactions to killings in like police chases and things, and showing how the kind of engagements with these kinds of difficult moral quandaries in certain comics examples kind of fuel that kind of cultural engagement with these kinds of important questions of crime and justice. So, does that help?
No, so I'll have one question then. Is there any trend visible right now in crime and comics, in the depictions of crime in comics, apart from the 9/11, or it's more general still, not that specified?
Yeah, from my knowledge, I think there is a wide-ranging engagement with the politics of crime and justice. So in one sense, you do have this post-9/11 issues around security and liberty, but there's some other examples around the age-old questions of vigilantism and the legitimacy of seeking justice outside the state, but also works engaging with the politics of crime and justice control, and the use of retributive justice, and putting justice in the hands of victims, and those kinds of things. So I think there is quite a wide-ranging kind of political engagement, depending on which title